in our first session, which I call the Blessed Hope, we've been through the promise, the process, and the purpose of the harpazo, or rapture. Now we'll go into the second session, which we're talking about patterns. We're talking about the prophetic profile that this all fits into, some problems that come up as a result of the subject, and then a final proposal. So let's take a look at the prophetic profile. You know, it's interesting that Jesus gave a confidential briefing on his second coming to his disciples. Actually, a very private briefing. Only 4 guys were there. 4 disciples: Peter, James, and John, the inner 3, plus Peter's brother Andrew. These 4. And Jesus gave them a briefing that's recorded in 3 of the 4 Gospels. And it's recorded, of course, in Matthew 24 and 25, which is usually regarded as the definitive one. Matthew took shorthand, so we have confidence that he probably had it almost verbatim. He had to have shorthand skills for his job as a customs official. That's pretty clear. It's also recorded in Mark 13, which is Peter's gospel, where Mark was his secretary, and in Luke 21, who reconstructed it from comments later. So, now, interestingly enough, the main point, I'm not going to go through those whole briefings, that's a study in itself, but the main point of those 3 records is that Jesus highlights a number of things that are non-signs. This, that, and the other thing will happen, but the end is not yet. But then he highlights what turns out to be the key to end-time prophecy. He points them to Daniel 9. There's a very famous passage. The last 4 verses of Daniel 9 are the key to understanding prophecy. If you take the trouble to really understand those 4 verses, then everything else will fall into place. It becomes a litmus test of many ideas if you really understand those 4 verses. Many books I've read that are confused are also confused about Daniel 9. You don't mention it, or they have some strange theories about it. It's pretty clear. You want to do a careful study of, if you really want to start your serious study of prophecy, you want to master the last 4 verses of Daniel 9. The so-called 70 weeks. Daniel was in prayer. He knew from his reading of the scriptures, namely Jeremiah, that the 70-year captivity was about up. So he knew that they were about to be released to go back home and rebuild the temple and so forth. And so as a result of knowing that, he goes to prayer. Now what a lesson that is. That's what Jesus tells us to do. When he says, when you pray, thy kingdom come. That's part of the Lord's Prayer. What are you praying for? For his kingdom to come, to be set upon the earth. It's astonishing that most churches don't believe that. Most churches somehow have we'll come back to that a little later. But anyway, so Daniel is in intense prayer, and in the first 19 verses of Daniel 9, as he prays for his people and himself and so forth, you can feel him tremble, even in the English translation. To watch the frequency of the verbs get tighter and tighter. You can almost see him tremble to the point where he's interrupted in that prayer by Gabriel, who then gives him this classic 4 verses. Daniel chapter 9, verse 24, there's a verse that gives you the scope of the whole thing. The next verse lays out in detail 69 weeks of years precisely. In fact, the precision of verse 25 of Daniel 9 is so astonishing. It's probably the thing that some 50 years ago galvanized me as a Christian. I'd already accepted the Lord, as many people have in their teens, whatever. But when I encountered, through some special tutoring, discovered what Sir Robert Anderson's unraveling of the 70 Weeks of Daniel, his classic work in 1894, is should be on everyone's library. The Coming Prince by Sir Robert Anderson. But in any case, verse 25 are 69 weeks. Then there's a very key verse to understand. That's verse 26, because it talks about some things that happen after the 69 weeks of years, but before the 70th, meaning they're not contiguous. Many people who get this muddled up don't recognize that all 70 are not contiguous. The first 69 are, then there's an interval with some specific things that happen in that interval, and then there's a final one. And that architecture of the 4 verses, once you understand that, it all starts to come together very clearly. The 69 weeks of years, the angel Gabriel tells Daniel that from the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem unto the Mashiach Nagid, the Messiah the King, would be 69 weeks of years. To make a long story short, that's 173,880 days. Well, we know the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem. That was under Nehemiah, the decree of Artaxerxes Longimanus, on March 14th of 445 BC. There are actually 4 decrees, but the other 3 had to do with the temple. If you study the book of Ezra, you know they tried to build the temple, had nothing but problems until Nehemiah got the authority for them to rebuild the city, and that's specifically expressed in verse 25. The big mystery is, okay, when did Jesus allow himself to be presented as a king? It turns out, if you study that carefully, there's only one day he allowed it to happen. Many times they tried and he said, "My hour is not yet come." Then one day, he dispatches his disciples to a particular place to give them a code word, release a donkey. He takes that donkey and he rides it from Bethany up over the Mount of Olives, down through the what's called the Golden Gate, into Jerusalem, deliberately fulfilling Zechariah 9:9, that the king would come presenting himself as a donkey. And that occurred on April 6, 32 AD, and these dates can be nailed down. The net of it is, it turns out that between those 2 dates is 173,880 days. Gabriel's margin for error was 0. He predicted the exact day that the Messiah would present himself as a king to Jerusalem. And what's astonishing about that, it's during that interval between those 2 dates that the entire Jewish scriptures, the Old Testament, what we call the Old Testament, was translated into Greek. It's called the Septuagint version, and that was done 3 centuries before. 3 centuries earlier, this prophecy was part of the Old Testament and therefore translated into Greek. So verse 25 of Daniel 9, in and of itself, when you understand the background and the rest of it, is one of the most astonishing demonstrations of the deity of Christ, that he really was who he said he was. Now the next verse that we want to focus on a little bit here is the interval. That's verse 26, between the 2. After 62 weeks shall the Messiah be karat, executed for capital crime, but not for himself. Who for? You and me. You got it, kid. Right on. But not for himself. And the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood. And in the end of the war, desolations are determined. Well, we all know that when Jesus rode that donkey, he predicted that the city would be destroyed. And 38 years later it was, under Titus Vespasian, when the Roman legions laid siege to the city and for 9 months slaughtered 1 million men, women, and children, and leveled Jerusalem. So the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the sanctuary. Who are the people of the prince that shall come? The Romans. Therefore, the prince that shall come, which is one of the titles of this final world ruler, we know he comes from the Roman Empire. That does not mean he comes from Western Europe. That's where many of us stumble, me included. So my earlier thing, I didn't realize. I stopped to think, because all of us forget that the eastern leg of the Roman Empire outlasted the western leg by 1,000 years. Constantine moved the capital of the world to Byzantium from Rome, called it Constantinople. And the scripture seems to indicate that the Antichrist will come from Assyria. As we move under tension, as we watch this cauldron of the Middle East boil over, as we anticipate tensions with Iraq, we realize that that's the region, ultimately, that this world leader is going to come from. So that's going to be exciting. Time to do our homework. But let's move on. Here's a diagram. The first, verse 25 was 69 weeks, 7 plus 62. Verse 26 was the interval that we've talked about. And in that interval, 4 days later, comes after the donkey ride, Jesus gets crucified, but not for himself. And then we have the temple destroyed. Those events took about 38 years, but we know this interval had to last at least 38 years. We've discovered by experience it's lasted better part of 2,000 years. But there is verse 27 of Daniel 9. It's the 70th week. 69 weeks were fulfilled with a precision that's astonishing. The 70th week has more details described about it in both the Old and the New Testament than any other period of time in human history. That's why we call this strange period the 70th week of Daniel. Since it's a week of years, many people call it the tribulation, the 7-year tribulation. And that's comfortable as an idiom of literature, but it's actually technically incorrect. 7 years for the week, yes, but the Great Tribulation is the last half of that week. So let's take a look at the 70th week. It's critical for us. It's defined